Here's another person who has Rahu in the second. And we're also going to look at this person's Ketu in the 8th dasha. It's only in about half the charts that you're going to see that a person's going to get both Rahu and Ketu dashas. About half the time a person will just get one and not live long enough to get the other. The only way a person's going to get both Rahu and Ketu dashas is usually if they get Rahu or Ketu dasha as their first or second dasha in life. And then there's a chance they can get both if they live over 60 years old, 50 years old or so. So there's not a lot of charts where you're going to see both dashas. And that's sort of an important consideration. If you see a chart where they're only going to get one because they're not going to get the other until they're 80 years old and most likely dead, or if you've done their longevity and you know they're going to expire before they get that other node dasha, that lets you know that in this lifetime they're really meant more to focus just on the Rahu. So in the previous video where we looked at that person will very likely never get their Ketu dasha. The other person we looked at that had Rahu in the second. Because they don't even get Rahu dasha until, they were like 30s or something like that. Till late enough that there's a good chance they won't get Ketu. But anyway, this person here got both, so we can actually look at both dashas. Now this person's got Rahu in second, Ketu in the 8th. Since Rahu's in the second, that lets us know right away that we need to also look at the Hora chart as a primary Varga for this person. In the Hora chart, Rahu's in the 8th from in the ascendant, but in the same Rashi as the second cusp. And Ketu's in the second from the ascendant, but in the same Rashi as the 8th cusp. So we see a similar theme, don't we? We see a second 8th house theme both in the Rashi and in the Hora chart. So that lets us know that the huge thing in this person's life is going to be security. In fact, we can say this whole person's life revolves around security because that second 8th house axis is the house of security. Second house is material security. 8th house is emotional security. Second house is our own ability to create resources, our own wealth. 8th house is the wealth of others. All of which combine together to make a person feel secure or threatened in this life. So those are very important houses. And it's because Rahu and Ketu threaten a person's security when they're in those houses that it becomes such a difficult thing. Rahu and Ketu are just so undependable that in those security houses they really are painful. So starting with this person's Rahu. It's not conjunct any planet, so it's not going to give the results of any planets it's conjunct. Its lord is Saturn, so it'll give the results of Saturn. And it's going to give the results of Saturn because it's Rahu. So that lets us know that the most important period in Antardasha and Rahu Dasha is going to be Rahu Saturn. Okay, Rahu Saturn will certainly be the most important period, okay? Other important period, well, Rahu Venus then, because Rahu Venus is always important. The other Antardashas of Rahu are not going to be as important, okay? Now, one other dasha that will be pretty important is, the next level of importance will be Rahu's sun, because in the Hora chart, Rahu's lord is the sun. So Rahu will give the effects of the sun there. Now, of course, Rahu is going to give the effects of, its lord and all the other Vargas. But the Vargas we want to start looking at for this person are going to be the Hora Varga because of the fact that Rahu's in the second. And it's not conjunct any house lord, so other Vargas just won't be as important. The most important area of life for this person in Rahu Dasha is going to be second house, material security, and therefore the Hora chart. Okay? So starting with the most important period, Rahu Saturn. Let's examine the Lajitadiya Vashta of Saturn. Saturn's sleeping, unfortunately. Right away we know Rahu Saturn period is going to be extremely difficult, demanding, and stressful. Saturn's aspected by the Sun to 55 points, who's sleeping. By the Moon to 22 points, who's not sleeping, and a natural enemy, so hurting him. By another enemy, Mars, who's hurting him because Mars is in a natural friend sign, so plenty of strength to hurt him. By Jupiter, a neutral, so it won't help or hinder him. by friend Mercury and friend Venus, both of which can help. But this Saturn is mostly mudita, mostly Shudita, mostly starved in its Lajitadya Vashta, because it has lots of influence from Mars, some good decent amount from Moon, and it starts out by being in a natural enemy sign in debilitation to begin with. So it's a terrible Saturn. It gets a little relief from Venus and Mercury, which just helps Saturn, not totally ruin everything, but it's not good. In the horror chart, let's see, Saturn is not the lord of Rahu, so we don't need to pay too much attention to Saturn there in that context, okay? So Rahu Saturn's not looking good. What happened in Rahu Saturn for this person, we grew up during World War II in Germany, and in Rahu Saturn period, the war overtook the part of Germany that they lived in, and all that territory of Germany was, lost to the Germans. What was it, to the Allies? The opponents of the Germans during World War II, and they literally had to run for their lives, swim across rivers while they were getting shot at by soldiers. So basically they lost all their material resources during that time. It was largely only because of the strength of the father. You see the nice Venus, the friend, ninth lord Venus, and the Karaka of father aspecting Saturn the most, that they were able to maintain, that they were able to live. The father was very strong, very fit, very intelligent, and plugged in enough that he was able to get away with his family early enough to basically swim all of his young kids across, hiding in reefs and rivers, swimming across rivers while people were shooting at him in the dark. So pretty freaky experiences for this person to go through under Rahu Saturn at a very young age, when they were just a child still. So terrible Rahu Saturn, but just the father helped them stay alive, because this is really a possibly death-inflicting period, Rahu Saturn. It's in the second house where Rahu loves to kill. Saturn is not only the second lord, it's also the debilitated Lagna lord. Okay, so it's a very, death-prone planet. But, Venus saves the day here. Mercury's there, helps a little bit as well, but largely it's that nice Venus, which is in Mula Trikona, so very strong, and retrograde makes them stronger too, okay, to give more help to that Saturn. But still a very tragic Rahu Saturn where all their resources were lost, and they, wash up in a part of Germany where they can survive without getting shot, but where they have absolutely nothing really to their names. Okay, the only thing they had to their names were their father's reputation, which was actually very high at the time. The father was, respected in the Nazi party, and had enough connections to help them stay alive, at least. Okay. Now, the other period that's going to be really, really important is going to be Rahu Venus. Okay. Rahu Venus, like I said, can make or break a person. Okay. Venus now is not getting activated by Rahu, but Venus is helping Rahu. If we look at aspects to Rahu, just looking at Rahu in general, Sun is aspecting Rahu as the 8th lord, so he's indifferent. Moon is aspecting as the 7th lord, so indifferent. Mars aspects Rahu to 15 points as the lord of the 11th, so that will show a narrow opinion about certain things, which will reduce the capacity for Rahu to create wealth and provide resources. It'll close Rahu down to that, unfortunately. Mercury is helping Rahu to 34 points. Okay, and at 34 points, it's also in good dignity, and it's also a good house lord, so it's opening up Rahu to financial wealth and security. So Mercury's good. Venus is, Jupiter's aspecting Rahu, Jupiter is the ruler of the third from the ascendant. So he's not a real helpful planet to Rahu. He's not going to open up Rahu to more wealth possibilities. Gives the wisdom and knowledge because it's Jupiter. But he's, Jupiter can be very idealistic about things. And these ideals would close down Rahu to, greater security. And then Venus helps at 27 points. It's not as strong as an aspect as Mercury, but Venus is a stronger planet because he's in Mula Trikona. So he's helping Rahu, which is good. He's a good house lord from the Lagna. He's helping Rahu. He's in good dignity. He's in a trine from Rahu. He's not in the, 6th, 8th, or 12th from Rahu, which, it's always better to have the Antardasha Lord in an angle or trine from the Dasha Lord. It's a pretty decent Venus. It's influenced by neutral Mars, helped by Saturn, a friend who's sleeping, who can't really help, therefore. But then he's also conjunct his friend Mercury, his natural friend Mercury. So that's a nice Venus. So in Rahu, Venus was a make it or break it point for this kid, where this kid finally was able to start getting a decent education, and a kid who really started flying with his education. This was a kid who didn't learn how to read or write until 10, because the war was such a travesty. It was just such a struggle for them to feed themselves, that even though their father was a university professor, an educator, there was just no time to even teach the kid to read or write, because it was all about just finding anything to eat. These kids were just, after Rahu, Saturn, for a large part of their time, were just doing anything they could to get just barely enough food to survive the day, all day long, just to get a few scraps of food, or maybe get one rabbit to spread, amongst 8, 9 people. So Rahu, Venus, things started improving. School started. He was able to get into school. He really struggled and worked very hard, and really started achieving, in school, and doing a very, an excellent job, basically. So Venus really bailed him out. And so Rahu, Venus was a turning point for this person to sort of become an intellectual. And as their life progressed, they, matured into an intellectual field. All of that was started in Rahu, Venus, really. Okay. Now, so those were the two most important periods. Rahu, Saturn decimated their lives. Rahu, Venus, started giving him a way out. And of course, that was a couple of years after the war ended. But still, it took years for, for a lot of people in Germany to really be having full bellies after the war. A lot of parents were not able to get work for 5 years after the war ended, literally where they were just banned from working, unfortunately. So it was a tough time, and this family and this individual suffered a lot of that toughness. So those are the most important periods. Now, of course, every period is going to do something, okay? Rahu, Jupiter was an interesting period for the family and the resources, because Jupiter is in great dignity. So it gives Rahu, capacity for increasing wealth and resources. And also the second house is the house of name, where you have a good name. You're recognized for being useful in your society. So Jupiter has that capacity, but Jupiter is the third lord and the 12th lord for Capricorn. He still closes Rahu off to that. So what happened in Rahu, Jupiter, is that his family actually got a lot of good name, because all of his older siblings, who are several years older than him, were old enough to be elected or selected for real premium education in the Nazi Party, with the idea that these children were going to go on to be the next rulers of Germany, the next great politicians, the rulers and generals and people in power in Germany. And a couple of his 2 older brothers were selected into that program. And that, of course, gave a lot of honor to the family. So you see Jupiter's giving that honor. But at the time, it really didn't give anything real. It really didn't give any wealth. It didn't help them eat. It was just an ideal, Jupiter's capacity that it gave, because Jupiter's so nice and strong. But it didn't give anything solid. It was basically an empty promise, as it turned out. Okay? Rahu, Saturn, we explained, very decimating. Rahu, Mercury. Now, Mercury is a good house lord from Capricorn. Mercury's got some strength. he's aspecting Rahu decently to 34 points. So Rahu Mercury will make Rahu a bit of an easier period. And it was after being decimated in Rahu Saturn period and Rahu Mercury period. They were, back to a safe place where they were secure at least, and their life wasn't threatened on a daily level. Okay, it was still difficult, as the entire Rahu Dasha was, but it was the period of overcoming this or surviving this decimation of Rahu Saturn. Rahu Ketu, always an important period to look at. Rahu Ketu period. Especially in this person's chart, because Rahu's in second in the Rashi, and Ketu's in the eighth. And eighth house has to do with other people's money, the second from the seventh. And so the planets in the eighth house lord is always good to look at in the horror chart too, to see what could be happening with your resources that are dependent upon other people. So here, in the Navamsha, Rahu's Lord Sun is debilitated and sleeping. Ketu's Lord Saturn is debilitated and sleeping. Okay? Now, Saturn, Ketu's Lord, to figure out what's happening. Well, let's start here. Rahu, Ketu here. Other people's resources, money from others. Ketu, is it going to be good or bad for that? Well, Ketu's Lord Sun is sleeping. Okay? The Sun is being squished by Venus, its enemy. Because Mercury is neutral there. It's aspected by Saturn, its enemy, who's sleeping, so can't help the Sun. But it's not a good Sun. It's a terrible, very starved Shuddhita Sun. It gets a little help of Mars and a little help of Jupiter, but nothing compared to conjunctions of an enemy Venus and being in an enemy Venus's debilitation sign to begin with. So we know Ketu is going to be really, really bad. Okay? Other people's money is not going to serve them well during that time. So here's a time of trying to develop their own resources, Rahu in the second. Had a very hard time with that because Rahu's Lord is debilitated. And Rahu's Lord is also debilitated in the horror chart. Okay? Then Ketu comes up, and Ketu is equally as bad. So then, Ketu gives the promise of, you can benefit from some other people's money, but that's going to fail. So in this period of time, there is the hope of government relief and stuff, but there just wasn't enough going around. There just was not enough for them going around during this time. So this was an extremely difficult time for this family where they were just literally starving in Rahu Ketu period. There just wasn't enough resources in the country to feed these people with parents out of work. And, this kid was selling cigarettes on the streets to try to get a few pennies, cigarettes that they would steal or whatever, so they can get a few pennies to buy a little bit of food. And of course, Ketu and Rahu both rule smoke and mist, so maybe that's where the cigarettes came in. And then they were just hunting, trying to, they had no guns, of course, no ammunition, of course, nothing. They were hunting rabbits in the snow with pitchforks and just hoping to get one wounded enough that they can catch it and kill it and have something to eat. So really another decimating period during this period. And you can see how Ketu's Lord Sun is conjunct the ninth Bhava cusp and smashing that ninth Bhava cusp. And a lot of this problem was because the father wasn't allowed to have work during that period. Because he'd been a member of the Nazi Party, he was not allowed to practice his profession for a few years after the war because he was an educator. And they didn't want educators who had Nazi ideals teaching the new generation of children. So, you can see this debilitated son at this point smash the father's ability to provide. And of course, the son is a karaka of the father too. So another really, really tough time. So you see how these debilitated lords of Rahu or Ketu, both in the Rashi and the horror chart, has made this person suffer really badly in Rahu Saturn and Rahu Ketu periods when it came to when it comes to their just surviving and feeding themselves. So it's just a struggle. Okay, and it's really, 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 really hard when you have Rahu at such a young age. It's just when people have Rahu at such a young age, it really leaves some pretty serious trauma in a person, especially a bad Rahu period, unless you have a great Rahu period. If a person has a great Rahu period, then maybe they'll just have so much wonderful things happen as a youth that the pressure becomes overwhelming, like they become a pop teen star or gymnastics champion. There's all this pressure that really is hard for a young kid to handle. But when Rahu or Ketu is really bad and gives a terrible childhood, a really tough childhood, the degree of trauma is huge, because Rahu doesn't mature until you're 42, which means we're really not ready to handle Rahu in a mature fashion until we're 42. And if a person has Rahu Dasha before they're 42, it's going to be, it potentially can leave a lot more trauma if it's a bad Rahu than if after 42. And of course, the earlier a person has it, the greater the trauma can be from Rahu Dasha if it's a bad Rahu. And this is a bad Rahu. Get some relief from Venus, get some relief from Mercury, but it's a bad Rahu. And so, this person, after that period, their whole life has revolved around saving every penny, living as cheaply and thriftily as possible, no matter how much money they make, buying land whenever they can so they feel like they have security, land that nobody can take away. They have a gun collection, so their whole life still revolves around this trauma of their early childhood of finding security, being secure and managing their resources and managing their money and not spending anything on luxuries or pleasures. Even if they have money, they don't. It's all about being frugal, because you never know when you're going to be starving. Even though they've eaten very well for the last, 60 years, basically. There's still that severe trauma of this very bad Rahu, in this person's life, unfortunately. So that's a tough Rahu. Okay, very tough Rahu for them. Okay, then Ketu Dasha. Jump way into the future, or into the recent present. Ketu Dasha, which is the Dasha they just finished recently. Ketu's lord, we've seen, is in Shuddhita, starved in the Rashi chart. So Ketu is not going to be a great Dasha. Okay, Ketu is also going to give the results of Mars. Mars, fortunately, is in the 12th in a natural friend sign with Jupiter. Anytime you get a Jupiter-Mars conjunction, it doesn't matter what house it's in, a Jupiter-Mars conjunction can always promote wealth. Okay? It always has possibilities of wealth. And of course, being in the 12th house, that's the house of long-term investments. Safe long-term investments are ruled by the 12th house. Things that naturally over time increase their value are 12th house investments. So that's a nice Mars for making long-term investments. Okay, so Ketu will give some of that Mars, luckily. But Ketu's, you see, Rahu himself is so much worse, because Rahu gives results of Saturn debilitated and his Lord debilitated. Ketu gives results of his Lord debilitated, but of a nice wealthy Mars. So there's some good stuff here. We want to look at Ketu in the horror chart again. In the horror chart, Ketu's Lord is debilitated again, Saturn, aspected by Moon, who's hurting him, by Mars, who's sleeping and not hurting him, helped by Mercury, helped by Venus, and Jupiter's not helping or hurting. So it's again a mediocre, slightly worse than mediocre Saturn. It's a bad Saturn, it's not very good. So Ketu is causing trouble here, activating Saturn, the 8th Lord, who's in bad shape. So we can see in Ketu Dashas there's going to be some 8th house, other people's money problems, okay, during this time. We also want to check, as an overview, the 4th Varga, the Chaturtamsha. The 4th Varga, why are we looking at that? Well, because Ketu is always going to give possible property stuff. So we always want to look at Ketu. There, Ketu's Lord is debilitated again. Saturn's debilitated as the 5th Lord. And Saturn's influenced by his enemy Sun, who's sleeping, luckily for Saturn, by Moon, who's hurting him, by Mars, who's sleeping, by Mercury, who's helping, and by Venus is helping. So he gets some relief from his friends Mercury and Venus, but he gets hurt by Moon and being debilitated to begin with. So it's a real mediocre Saturn. It's not totally trash. It gets some good help from Venus and Mercury, and it helps that its ruler, its Lord Mars, is weak, and that keeps Saturn from being sapped as much by Mars. But it's not good by any means. It's not good by any means. So we don't see Ketu's Lord being good anywhere. The only good thing we have going is this Jupiter-Mars conjunctions, which will always give some wealth. Okay, always. Now, in Ketu period, a lot of things happen. One thing that happened is the real estate market started to decline. As a result, some property values they had declined a bit as well. Not too much. Luckily, they're in places that weren't heavily inflated. Their real estate wasn't in California, basically. And we can see that because in the fourth Varga, Mars is not in great dignity. He's in a natural enemy sign. His dignity is neutral, and Jupiter is also neutral. They're both in a neutral dignity, so that's good at least. At least they're not in a great enemy's dignity or enemy's dignity. But they are in a natural enemy's dignity, so it's not good. So they're neutral, and neutral dignity means a planet suffers scarcity. So they suffer a little bit of loss in their financial values, but they still maintain most of it because at least it's not an enemy sign. And in the Rashi chart, Mars and Jupiter are really promising. So during this time, they have the wealth that comes from their property at least. Okay, maybe it's not as good as it used to be, but it's good enough. What they don't have is 8th house things, other people's money, the Lord debilitated in the Rashi and the horror chart. So during this time, they decided it was time to apply for their Social Security benefits. Unfortunately, one of the places they worked at, one of the universities they worked at, mishandled or misplaced all their Social Security files and never supplied those to the IRS. So there was no record of this person having worked for several years during which they drew a really high income. As a result, their Social Security payments were going to be a fraction of what they were supposed to be. So this person tried to sort that out for a very long time, with no luck, because nothing the university could do was able to make up for the mistake they'd made, and this person was basically got screwed, okay, and lost this, these Social Security benefits. Social Security benefits are 8th house benefits. And you see how the sun is the government and how the government doesn't give them the money because, it's messed up. Now, in Ketu Jupiter, though, because remember what I said, Ketu Jupiter can always be a possibly good period, or it at least can give some relief. Well, in Ketu Jupiter period is when the person finally, submitted their Social Security and started taking their Social Security and started getting some relief. But it wasn't as much as it should have been. Why? Because Ketu himself sucks. But at least it gave some relief and some money from the government, some other people's monies. But there's no way that person's Ketu Jupiter was going to be fantastic simply because Ketu is in such bad shape. Okay? But that relief came in Ketu Jupiter period. Okay? Now, and the problem with that started in Ketu Sun. Ketu Sun is when it was revealed to this person that they had lost years of their Social Security benefits through the mistake of the university. Okay? So we can see how Ketu's destroyed their security in the context of what they get from other people's money. Okay? So very unfortunate there as well. But Jupiter, and that problem came into their lives in Ketu Sun. And in Ketu Jupiter, they resolved that problem as beneficially as they could. Okay? Okay. And, their livelihood during that Ketu Dasha largely came from the Ketu given the effects of Mars, long-term investments in real estate. So this person bought a lot of properties, basically in the 70s, that over 30 years matured very nicely financially. And, when they need money, they just sell a property and live off that in their retirement to boost their lack of Social Security. Okay? So again, difficult Ketu here. Not one of these Ketu periods that gives a wonderful windfall and a lot of benefits. But a lot better than the Rahu Dasha, simply because Ketu is going to give the effects of Mars, and Mars is good at least. Okay, whereas Rahu is going to give the effects of its Lord bad and Saturn both bad. So really, really a bad Rahu and a pretty, definitely worse than you want Ketu. Okay? All right, so I hope that's another good example for how to look at these nodes, Rahu and Ketu, and see. One thing we can look a little more at Ketu, just the influences to Ketu. We know his Lord is giving him trouble. He's going to give bad effects of his Lord. Otherwise, Ketu is influenced by 7th Lord Moon, indifferent, by Mars, the 11th Lord from the Lagna, so a strong opinion focused planet that will cut down on his capacity to benefit and manage and create resources with others. Then by Jupiter, the idealism that will somehow create ideals within his mind that will close him down from having benefits with other people's resources. So you can see there's a dominance of evil house lords influencing this Ketu. So this Ketu is not the type of Ketu that really knows how to work with people in a way so as to develop their own resources. Rather, this Ketu will have a strong idealism and a strong-minded, opinionated to it that this person will have that will actually close the doors to really what they can benefit from with other people. Okay, so they're not really good at doing that. Again, 3rd Lord Jupiter and 11th Lord from Rashi Mars, they're going to be focused on their own goals, their own agenda. They're not going to be focused on helping Ketu be more open to maturing their resources with other people. So this is a person that it's not a type of person you could work with and really generate resources together, generate things of value together. And so as a result, people end up not being as important in this person's life because the 8th house is the wealth we generate with our partners, whether it's our marriage partner or our business partner. If it's our business partner, it's the financial wealth. If it's the marriage partner, it's the emotional wealth that we generate with that partner. And that's what makes a partnership worthwhile. So look at the 8th house as the worthwhileness of any partnership. With this Ketu here in bad shape in that 8th house with the debilitated Lord and being strongly influenced by difficult house lords, which are going to close Ketu off to that possibility, this person's just not the kind of person to really focus on generating value with their partners, unfortunately. And that'll make their relationship life and their partnerships so much less fulfilling. Okay? Remember, the 8th house has a lot to say about the fulfillment and the bonding that happens with your partners. If your financial wealth with them, if you're manifesting financial wealth or manifesting emotional wealth with your partners, then you're bonded to them and they're important to your life and they matter. But if you're not, they're just not that important because they're not benefiting you, they're not enriching you. So that 8th house is that enrichment you get with other people. In this person's chart, that 8th house is not in good shape. So that's been a problem in their lives, and